I barely had time to set my last moving box down before Karen Wilkins showed up at my doorstep, binder in hand, ready to establish who really owned my house. I should have known the moment I heard the sharp double chime of my doorbell, the kind of sound that doesn't just request attention, it demands it. I opened the door, and there she was, Karen Wilkins, HOA president, neighborhood overlord. The self-proclaimed goddess of Sunnyside Estates, she stood there, white pantsuit pressed to perfection, pearl necklace gleaming under the afternoon sun. Her blonde bob, so aggressively styled, looked like it had been sculpted from solid plastic. "Hello?" "There," she chirped, flashing a perfectly rehearsed smile. "I'm Karen Wilkins, president of the Sunnyside Estates HOA." Then, before I could even reply, she thrust a massive binder into my hands, gold embossed, thick as a brick. I looked down at it, confused, then back up at her. She patted the cover as if handing over a sacred text. "This is the Sunnyside Estates. Community guidelines. All 78 pages are mandatory reading." 78 pages, I blinked. "That's thorough." Karen's smile didn't budge. "We take pride in maintaining a certain standard in our neighborhood." Her tone made it clear. This wasn't just any set of rules. This was her manifesto. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I suggest highlighting the sections on lawn maintenance and exterior modifications." A pause. Then, the knife twist. "We've had issues with new homeowners in the past." Issues. The way she said it sent a clear message. This wasn't a friendly tip. This was a warning. I forced a polite smile. "I'll be sure to look it over." She nodded approvingly, eyes flicking over my yard like a predator surveying its next meal. Then, just as suddenly as she arrived, she turned on her heel and marched back to her luxury SUV, clipboard clutched like a weapon. I stood there for a moment, watching her drive off, still holding the HOA Bible in my hands. Welcome to Karen's kingdom. That night, after hours of unpacking, I made the mistake of actually opening the binder. I figured I'd skim it. Maybe a few basic rules about keeping your lawn tidy, not blasting music at 3 a.m., standard HOA stuff. I was wrong. This wasn't a set of rules. This was a dictatorship disguised as a manual. Some highlights: exterior paint colors, only 12 approved. Shades of beige. Front doors must complement the house but cannot stand out too much. Mailbox design strictly standardized. Lawn height exactly 3.5 inches, no more, no less. Trash bins can only be visible outside within a precise 12-hour window on collection day. But the best part? The approved flowers list. An entire chart detailing which flowers were acceptable, categorized by season, color, and community aesthetic compliance. Who the hell polices flowers? I closed the binder and ran a hand down my face. This was insanity. But fine. I could play along. For 6 months, I played Karen's game. I followed every rule in that 78-page manifesto. My lawn, trimmed to exactly 3.5 inches. My trash bins, out at 7:00 a.m. sharp, back inside by 7:00 p.m. on collection day. Mailbox, perfectly matched the approved matte black design. I even painted my front door sandstone whisper because, apparently, corner lots with eastern exposure were only allowed that one specific shade of beige. And for a while, it worked. Karen barely glanced at my house during her daily patrols. Oh yeah, daily. Every morning, like clockwork, she'd drive through Sunnyside Estates in her luxury SUV, clipboard in hand, scanning the neighborhood for infractions, and God help you if you were caught violating the sacred HOA laws. Karen's rule of terror. It didn't take long to realize that Karen didn't enforce rules. She weaponized them. She wasn't out to maintain the beauty of the community. No, she was on a power trip. One morning I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor, standing in her driveway, clutching a bright pink violation notice like it was a death sentence. "What happened?" I asked. She sighed, shaking her head. "Apparently, my grandson's car was parked in my driveway for too long." I frowned. "How long was it there?" She looked at me, dead serious. 4 hours. 4 hours. Her own. Grandson had come over to help fix a leaky roof, and Karen had slapped her with a fine before he even had a chance to leave. Another time I watched as Mr. Chen, the high school science teacher, got fined because his trash bin was visible 2 minutes before the approved pickup window. 2 minutes. Karen even went after Mrs. Johnson, an 82-year-old widow, because, get this, her flower pots were too vibrant and disrupted the neighborhood's color harmony. She made her dig up her own flowers. At 82 years old, I wanted to believe these were just isolated incidents, that maybe I was imagining things, but every day I saw more and more neighbors getting fined, harassed, humiliated. The worst part? No one ever fought back. They were too scared, because Karen had connections. She knew people on the town council, she had lawyers on speed dial, and if you crossed her, suddenly you'd start getting random fines, mysterious code violations, mysterious plumbing issues, mysterious lost mail. Karen ran Sunnyside Estates like a dictatorship. And me? I was trapped in it. But as long as I followed the rules, I was safe. Or at least, that's what I thought. Until the day I planted hedges. And that's when the war began. For 6 months, I had played the perfect homeowner. I followed every rule, dotted every I, crossed every T. I kept my head down, stayed out of trouble, and watched as my neighbors got fined for ridiculous things, like mailboxes that were too glossy or wind chimes that were audible from the sidewalk. I thought I was safe. I thought I had beaten Karen at her own game. Then one afternoon I came home, and my hedges were gone. The crime scene. I pulled into my driveway and immediately knew something was wrong. The neat, lush green privacy screen I had planted along my side yard, the one I had carefully planned, selected, and triple-checked against HOA regulations, it had been butchered. What had once been a beautiful row of emerald green arborvitaes was now a collection of sad, mutilated stumps, barely 3 feet tall. Threw my truck into park and jumped out. And there, standing in my yard, clipboard in hand, watching 2 landscapers pack up their hedge trimmers like it was just another Tuesday, was Karen Wilkins. She turned to face me, tilting her head just slightly, her signature plastic smile already in place. "Oh, Michael," she said, adjusting her designer sunglasses. I was just about to leave. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice steady. "What happened to my hedges?" She sighed like she was dealing with a child. "They were in violation of Code 4.7b, obstructing the critical sightline at the corner. For safety reasons, the board approved immediate corrective action." I blinked. "Immediate corrective action?" Karen waved a hand dismissively. "It's all in the email we sent out last week." I pulled out my phone on the spot. No email, no warning, no notification. She watched me scroll, her smile widening. "Oh, dear," she said, shaking her head. "It must have gone to spam, but don't worry, the issue has been resolved." I looked back at my ruined hedges, my $2,000 investment destroyed. I gritted my teeth. "You had no right," Karen laughed, actually laughed. "Oh, Michael," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "As HOA president, I have the authority to take action when a homeowner fails to comply after proper notification." Her eyes flicked to the bright orange flag suddenly staked into my lawn, one that definitely wasn't there this morning. "This area," she continued, tapping her clipboard, "has now been designated a sightline protection zone. No structures over 3 feet tall are permitted." She gestured at the freshly mutilated shrubs. "And now you're in compliance." I took a slow breath, feeling the heat rise to my face. "You didn't even give me a chance to fix it myself," she sighed again, stepping closer like she was about to pat me on the shoulder. "Michael," she said sweetly, "you seem like a nice man, so let me give you some advice." She leaned in slightly. "Don't fight this. It won't end well for you." And then, because of course she did, she handed me an invoice. "The association will be billing you $375 for the landscaping service." I looked down at the bill for my own destruction, then back at her smug, victorious face. And in that moment, I made a decision. She thought she won. She was wrong. That night, I pored over the HOA handbook, searching for a way to fight back. And that's when I found it. Karen had destroyed my hedges, because natural privacy barriers had height restrictions. But you know what didn't? Structural privacy barriers. I read the rule 3 times to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Perimeter walls made from approved materials up to 6 feet tall were perfectly legal, and there, in black and white, was the loophole Karen had overlooked. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was upset, not because I was mourning my murdered Hedges. I didn't sleep because I was planning my revenge. Karen thought she had won, thought she had backed me into a corner, proved her authority, put me in my place. She had no idea who she was dealing with, because while she was busy flexing her power, she had forgotten one important detail. I'm a structural engineer. I know building codes better than anyone. And as I flipped through the HOA handbook for the 100th time, something beautiful caught my eye. A loophole. She had destroyed my hedges because they were a natural privacy barrier, and natural barriers had a maximum height of 3 feet in sightline areas. Fine, but structural privacy barriers, they were an entirely different category. According to Section 7, 3 of the HOA guidelines, perimeter walls, made from approved materials up to 6 feet tall, were perfectly legal. Even better? The HOA's Architectural Review Committee had 14 days to approve or deny an application, and if they failed to respond in time, the application was automatically approved. I double-checked, triple-checked. It was right there in the rules. I didn't just have a solution, I had a checkmate. The application that would change everything. The next morning, I drove to the HOA office and submitted my official request to build a 6-foot cinder block privacy wall. Not a cheap DIY job, no, I included professional blueprints, perks of being an engineer. Material specifications, HOA approved, of course. Computerized renderings showing exactly how the wall would look. A notarized statement confirming that my design met all HOA and county regulations. I handed the stamped, sealed application to the receptionist and walked out, knowing exactly what was going to happen next. The waiting game. I didn't expect an immediate response. I knew Karen. She wasn't going to approve anything I submitted. She was going to stall, ignore, delay, and that was exactly what I wanted. Because the longer she ignored my request, the closer I got to automatic approval. Days passed, a week, then 10 days. I called twice to check on the status of my application. Both times, I got the same robotic response. The committee is still reviewing it. Translation? Karen was sitting on it, hoping I'd forget. Too bad for her. I don't forget. On day 15, I drove to the HOA office again. I walked in, calm, polite, professional. "Good morning," I said to the receptionist. "I'm here to pick up my approved application." She blinked. "Oh, I don't think it's been approved yet." I smiled. "Actually, it has." I pulled out my stamped receipt, placed it on the counter, and tapped the relevant bylaw in the HOA handbook. According to Section 7.3, failure to respond within 14 days results in automatic approval. Today is day 15. Her face went pale. She fumbled for a response, but we both knew it was over. I had my approval, and Karen? She had no idea what was coming. I knew the moment Karen found out, not because she called me, not because she emailed. I knew because, at precisely 7 a.m., her luxury SUV came screeching to a halt in front of my house like she was responding to a crime scene. She threw open her car door and stormed across my lawn, heels sinking into the grass, clipboard clutched like a weapon. I calmly set down my coffee. I had been waiting for this. "What do you think you're doing?" she screeched, pointing at the bright orange construction markers outlining where my perfectly legal 6-foot wall was about to go. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Building a structurally sound, HOA-compliant privacy wall." Her face turned an impressive shade of red. "That application was never approved," she snapped. I smiled. "Actually, it was?" I pulled out my stamped, time-stamped, notarized approval document and held it up like a holy relic. Her eyes flicked to the date. Day 15, automatic approval. I saw the moment she realized she had lost. Her jaw clenched. Her fingers tightened around her clipboard. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. Not yet. the dirty tactics begin. She took a deep breath, forcing that plastic HOA president smile back onto her face. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I do. Hope you're following all proper city regulations." I raised an eyebrow. "Of course. I filed for my county building permits before submitting the HOA request." She blinked. That was not the answer she was expecting. I see," she stammered. "Well, I'll be watching to make sure everything is done by the book," and with that she turned on her heel and stomped back to her SUV. I watched her speed off, smiling to myself. I knew exactly what was coming next. The weaponization of bureaucracy Karen couldn't stop my project, but she could try to bury me in red tape, and she tried. The next morning I got a visit from the county inspector. "Hey there," he said, stepping out of his truck. "Got a complaint about an unpermitted structure?" I grinned. Let me guess. Karen Wilkins?" He chuckled. "Didn't say a name. But yeah, it's Karen." I handed him my permit documents before he even asked. "Everything's legal." He skimmed them, nodded, and said, "Looks good to me." Karen. 0. Me. 1. The day after that, a surprise environmental impact review request. The inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, looking exhausted. "HOA called about potential drainage issues," he sighed. I handed him the pre-approved drainage plan I had already submitted. "To the county." He scanned it, nodded, and said, "You're fine." Karen. 0. Me. 2. Then, 3 days later, a fire department inspection. Because apparently, my construction site was a safety hazard. Fire chief showed up, looked around for about 30 seconds, then turned to me. "Yeah, this is nonsense." Karen. 0. Me. 3 for 2 weeks, she kept trying. Noise complaints, property line disputes, even an accusation that my wall would cause wildlife displacement. Each time I was one step ahead. Each time the inspectors left annoyed. At Karen, not me. And each time I made sure to smile and wave as her SUV drove past, watching helplessly as my wall took shape. Karen was losing, and she knew it. I knew Karen was petty, I knew she was vindictive, but I didn't know she was corrupt. Not yet. At first I was too focused on finishing my wall to worry about anything else. Karen had spent 2 weeks throwing every bureaucratic roadblock she could at me. Complaints, inspections, bogus violations. And she lost. My 6-foot cinder block monument of defiance was nearly complete. But then something unexpected happened. A neighbor knocked on my door. The first crack in Karen's empire, it was Mrs. Chen, a retired accountant who lived 3 houses down. She had watched Karen's antics for years but never spoke up, until now. "I heard about your trouble with the HOA," she said, stepping inside. I nodded. "Yeah, Karen's been on a warpath." Mrs. Chen gave a knowing smirk. She's always been like that. "But I think you should see something." She handed me a thick folder. "What's this?" I asked, flipping it open. She adjusted her glasses. "The HOA's financial records. At least, the ones I was able to get before Karen kicked me off the board." I raised an eyebrow. "Karen removed you?" Mrs. Chen nodded. 2 years ago. I started asking too many questions. She made up some nonsense about conflicts of interest and replaced me with her friend, who, by the way, has 0 accounting experience. I glanced down at the records. Numbers, transactions, but something immediately stood out. A $30,000 expense marked as Community Beautification Project. I frowned. "What the hell is this?" Mrs. Chen smirked. "A fountain," I blinked. "Wait. The ugly one at the entrance?" She nodded. "The one with no permits, no approval, and, oh yeah, was built by Karen's brother-in-law's company." My jaw clenched. $30,000 of HOA funds. Gone. The house of cards begins to fall. I flipped through more pages, and that's when I saw it. Karen had been funneling HOA contracts to her friends. The landscaping company that kept hiking up fees, owned by Karen's cousin, the security patrol service that did nothing but drive around and find people. run by Karen's golf buddy. The legal firm handling HOA disputes, her college roommate's husband, every contract, overpriced, every vendor handpicked, and yet our HOA fees kept going up. "This is theft," I muttered. Mrs. Chen nodded. "That's why I brought it to you. Karen controls the board. No one dares speak up." I closed the folder, a slow grin spreading across my face. "Oh, don't worry," I said. "I'm not just going to speak up." I tapped the stack of incriminating documents on the table. "I'm going to burn her whole empire to the ground." The moment I saw the $30,000 fountain scam, I knew one thing for sure. Karen Wilkins wasn't just a tyrant. She was a thief, and I was going to prove it. But I needed more. More proof. More witnesses. More voices willing to stand up and fight. Karen had spent years silencing her critics, but what happens when everyone starts talking at once? She was about to find out. The investigation begins. The next morning, I dug in. I spread every document Mrs. Chen had given me across my kitchen table and started connecting the dots. And the deeper I looked, the worse it got. The $30,000 fountain scam, completely unapproved, no permits filed, and mysteriously over budget. The HOA landscaping contract, Karen had switched vendors 3 years ago to a company owned by her cousin, and suddenly costs doubled. The HOA's legal team? They had been paid tens of thousands of dollars, but somehow no actual legal disputes had ever been recorded. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was a racket, and Karen had been lining her pockets while terrorizing homeowners with fines for mailboxes that were too reflective. Building the resistance. I needed more than just numbers. I needed witnesses, so I started knocking on doors. Mr. Chen, the teacher, targeted for parking wrong. The first person I visited was Mr. Chen, the high school science teacher. He answered his door with a wary look. I held up my folder. "You ever wonder why your HOA fees keep going up?" He sighed. "You have no idea. They fined me last year because my car was parked 1 inch over the driveway line." I flipped open my notes. "You weren't the only one." His eyes narrowed. "Tell me everything." Mrs. Rodriguez, fined for letting her grandson visit. Next, I talked to Mrs. Rodriguez. She shook her head. "I've lived here for 20 years. I never had a problem until Karen took over." She pulled out her own stack of violation notices, a foot-high pile of ridiculous fines. Her crime? Her grandson had parked in her driveway for 4 hours. Mrs. Johnson, forced to remove her flowers. Then there was Mrs. Johnson, the 82-year-old widow Karen had fined for having unauthorized flowers. She still looked haunted as she described how Karen had made her rip them out by hand. I clenched my jaw. "How much was the fine?" she sighed. $200. For flowers. Meanwhile, Karen was blowing HOA funds on luxury landscaping contracts and fountains that nobody asked for. The smoking gun. And then, the real jackpot hit. Mrs. Chen, the former HOA treasurer, called me the next evening. "I was digging through my old emails," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I found something." She sent me a forwarded message from Karen, a direct order to the HOA accounting. "Team, move $20,000 to consulting fees and process it under legal expenses. Make sure the board doesn't see the final report." A paper trail, a direct attempt to cover up stolen HOA funds. I stared at the screen, heartbeat pounding. This wasn't just incompetence, this was fraud. And Karen had just signed her own downfall. The plan comes together. By the end of the week, I had financial records proving Karen had misused HOA funds, multiple witnesses willing to testify about Karen's abuse of power, a literal smoking gun, her own email, directing an illegal financial cover-up. This wasn't just a complaint, this was a case. A scandal waiting to explode. And Karen? She had no idea the walls were closing in. Karen had ruled Sunnyside Estates for years, issuing fines, making up violations, draining HOA funds for her personal pet projects. She thought she was untouchable. She thought no one would dare challenge her. That was about to change. Because tonight, at the HOA's annual meeting, I was about to set fire to her empire. Setting the stage. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse. I arrived early, not just to get a good seat, but to prepare my final move. I carried 3 boxes, each one filled with neatly sealed envelopes, each envelope containing the full investigation report on Karen Wilkins. Financial fraud, selective enforcement, illegal contracts. The whole damn thing I set up at the entrance. And as homeowners filtered in, I handed each one an envelope. "Read this before the meeting starts," I said, keeping my voice calm, controlled. They took them, some curious, some skeptical. Then, as they opened the reports, the entire atmosphere shifted. The murmurs started as a whisper, then a low murmur, then within minutes a wave of shocked reactions spread through the crowd. I watched as neighbors exchanged wide-eyed glances, flipping through pages of cold, hard proof. The $30,000 stolen for an unapproved fountain, the illegal vendor contracts funneled to Karen's friends and family, the email where Karen directed a financial cover-up. Mrs. Rodriguez's hands trembled as she read. "She stole our money," she whispered. Mr. Chen shook his head in disbelief. "I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined this." Even Mrs. Johnson, the 82-year-old widow Karen forced to rip up her flowers, looked ready to tear Karen apart. And Karen? Karen hadn't arrived yet. Karen walks into the storm at 6:58 p.m. The door swung open, and in she walked. Karen Wilkins, dressed in her signature white pantsuit, pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights, clipboard tucked under. Her arm, chin held high, oblivious to the tension choking the room. Then she stopped. She noticed the envelopes in everyone's hands. She saw the way they were looking at her, not with respect, not with fear, but with rage. Her smile faltered. She clutched her clipboard tighter, marching toward the podium like she could still control the room. She had no idea she was already finished. Karen stood at the podium, gripping her clipboard like it was a lifeline. She cleared her throat, trying to salvage control. "All right, let's begin. First on the agenda." She never made it past the first sentence. Mrs. Chen stood up. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen Wilkins as HOA president." The room exploded. A dozen voices instantly seconded the motion. Karen's face drained of color. This is completely out of order," she stammered, voice rising in panic. Mrs. Rodriguez stood next. "Actually, Karen, it's completely within the bylaws. And unlike you, we actually follow the rules." A low murmur of agreement spread through the room. Karen's hands clenched into fists. These accusations are baseless lies." I stood up slowly and walked toward the front of the room. I held up the investigation report. "Karen," I said calmly, "which part is a lie? The $30,000 you funneled into an unapproved fountain? The illegal contracts with your family members? The email where you tried to cover up missing HOA funds?" Her mouth opened and closed. No words came out because there was nothing she could say. The entire room was watching her. Neighbors she had bullied for years, homeowners she had fined for ridiculous reasons, residents she had thought were too scared to fight back. Not anymore. Mr. Chen raised his hand. "Let's vote." The end of Karen's reign. The vote was counted on the spot. In favor. 3 abstained. 2 against, Karen and her only friend. She was done. The vice president of the HOA, an older gentleman named David Thompson, a retired school principal, stepped forward. "In accordance with HOA bylaws," he said officially, "Karen Wilkins is hereby removed from office, effective immediately." Karen froze. Her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for a way to claw back power, but there was none. For the first time in years, she had no control. Her own rules, the very system she had weaponized to terrorize homeowners, had been used against her. She had been defeated, and I had done it by following the rules. The aftermath. Karen stormed out, slamming the door behind her. No one followed, no one cared. The new HOA president, David Thompson, took over immediately. His first act? Order an external audit of all HOA funds from the last 5 years. 2. Suspend all outstanding fines until they could be reviewed for fairness. 3. Draft new bylaws with clear limits on HOA power, and just like that, The tyranny was over. Victory. I walked home that night, grinning. My 6-foot wall stood tall, a symbol of what happens when you fight back the right way. Karen thought she could control everything. She thought she could bend the rules to her will. She thought she could never be beaten. She was wrong, and I made sure she would never forget it.